Free agency in the NFL is just a couple of weeks away. Now, the Jets are probably not going to be one of the big spending teams this year, but there are some key free agents out there who could help the team fill critical needs. We'll talk about free agents the Jets should be interested in today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Friday, February 28th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listener, first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Well, today we're going to talk about free agency, which is not a topic we've discussed all that much this offseason on the show, but it's sneaking up on us. And we're going to look at some of the key free agents out there who could fill pivotal needs for the New York Jets this offseason. Now, I think that there's a bit of a misconception happening in the Jets fan base right now. And I think if we're being honest, this is going to be an offseason where the Jets are probably not going to be huge spenders. The cap situation just needs to be straightened out. Jets have a lot of holes to fill. But I think that there's this misconception that the Jets are tanking next season. The Jets just aren't even going to try and win. And that's not true. And head coach Aaron Glenn has even kind of dispelled that myth. And we talked about how we're trying to win now and we're going to try to win in the future. Now, you're not going to see the Jets be as aggressive as they've been the last 2 years. And I would even argue the Jets have been reckless the last 2 years, where they have essentially been chasing immediate results at the expense of the long term. Really, what the Jets are going to do, I think, is they'll think about the long term, which will be a change, but they're still going to try and find players who will help the team right now. The difference is now we're going to try and find a balance. We're not just going to try and win. We are going to try and win now, but we're also not going to hurt ourselves long term. We're going to try and balance the now versus the later. And I think there are some free agents out there who could help the Jets do this. Now, if we're talking at the wide receiver position, Jets have Garrett Wilson, who increasingly sounds like he'll be back. There were rumblings that Garrett Wilson was very unhappy near the end of the season, but those rumblings have kind of died down since the Jets announced Aaron Rodgers was not coming back. And, you have the whole dynamic with Rodgers feeding the ball to Devontae Adams and to a lesser extent, Allen Lazard, and maybe frustrating Garrett Wilson, which frankly was one of the most predictable things in the world at the time the Jets traded for Adams. But Rodgers is going to be gone. Adams, at a cap number well over $30 million, and a guy at 32 years of age, it doesn't make a lot of sense for the New York Jets right now. Talking about balancing the now versus the later, that's a situation where the now would come at the expense of the later, because you'd be paying this guy who's older, who won't be able to help you in 3 years, all this money. I guess this is not exactly the most insightful or the most shocking player for the Jets to target, because many free agent lists have him as the top free agent overall this offseason. But the guy I'm looking at, and the guy I've been talking about for a couple of years, who I think the Jets should really be in on, is Tee Higgins from Cincinnati. Now, I think Higgins is looking at a mega deal. And I think if the Bengals are smart, they'll figure out a way to keep him. And I understand they have Joe Burrow, and I understand they have Jamar Chase. But one of the things that makes the Bengals so dangerous is how many weapons they have in the passing game. Burrow to Chase, but also Burrow to Higgins. Higgins is essentially a number one receiver in a number two receiver role, and he's going to get an enormous contract. Now, you may be saying, well, John, you've just been talking about how tight the Jets are against the cap. The thing is, you can always figure out a way to fit one player in. And when that player is somebody like a Tee Higgins, who's only 26, and this plays into it, because Tee Higgins has just been a fantastic receiver since he set foot on the field. His first year, he had 908 yards, then back-to-back 1,000-yard seasons. 2023, his fourth year, he was banged up. He only played 12 games, but still had 656 yards. And then this year, went over 900 yards despite only playing 12 games. I think in many ways, he's a perfect complement to Garrett Wilson. And you may ask, can the Jets afford to pay Garrett Wilson after getting Tee Higgins? And the answer to that is yes, just as the Bengals can probably afford to pay Tee Higgins and Jamar Chase. You want to prioritize making an area of strength. Wide receiver is not a bad place to look. And I think that in many ways, Higgins is a perfect complement to Garrett Wilson. He does a lot of the things Garrett Wilson can't do. Higgins he's a bigger type of receiver. Garrett Wilson's a bit undersized. Higgins 6'4", 219. And guy who's been a great weapon. If we're talking about the Jets, like trying to figure out the quarterback position, there's no better way to do it than to have a 1-2 punch like a Tee Higgins and Garrett Wilson. Now that's not going to be easy because Jets aren't going to be the only team that's interested in Tee Higgins, even if he becomes available, which is not a guarantee because if the Bengals are smart, I think they'll figure out the Higgins situation sooner rather than later. But even though the Jets have a tight cap situation, you have to remember you can structure deals in all different ways. If you have a tight cap this year, and the cap's going to be less tight because it sounds like they're going to make Aaron Rodgers a post June 1st cut, which means that they'll have more money to play with, a lot more money to play with than they would if Rodgers was a cut, if Rodgers was just a regular cut, because now Rodgers is only going to count $14 million against the cap next season versus the 49 he would have if he was a regular cut. So you can like figure out a way to make the first year cap hit relatively low and and maybe make bigger cap hits in years where you have more flexibility down the line. There's an ability to do that. I think that in the NFL, having a playmaker at the wide receiver position is important, and having two gives you an enormous advantage. So I mean, and the big thing with Higgins is he's 26 versus Devontae Adams, who's 32. If Devontae Adams was 26, the narrative around him would be very different. But Higgins is a guy who's been tremendously productive through his career. And like I said, the Jets would not be the only team that would be interested in him. Aaron Glenn the other day at the combine said, if you're good at the wide receiver position, we'll be interested in you. I think the Jets should certainly be interested in Tee Higgins. But like I said, a lot of teams are going to be interested in him. So one of the things I want to do with each player I can give you is give you a backup plan. And I think for the Jets at the receiver position, the backup plan should be Chris Godwin from Tampa Bay. And this is a player who haunts Jets fans because the Jets drafted Ardarius Stewart in 2017 over him. And Ardarius Stewart really did nothing in the NFL while Godwin's going on to have a fantastic career. I mean, Godwin's a guy who has 4,000-yard seasons, been in the NFL since 2017. Probably, very well may have 6 in a row if he hadn't suffered injuries in 2020 and then an ankle injury in 2024. He's still on the right side of 30, now barely, but he's 29 years old. Now, he is coming off a serious ankle injury, which ended his season. And I know, whenever I'm suggesting a receiver who suffered a serious injury to end his season, it's going to bring objections. And the reason it's going to bring objections is because we just went through that with Mike Williams. When the Jets signed him last year, Williams had a fantastic track record and did not produce at all after coming to the Jets and really did not look like the same player. I understand the concerns. And look, when I say Godwin should be the backup plan, that's not to say, I know about his medicals. Of course, the doctors and the medical team should check him out. And if the medical team says it's a no-go, then it's a no-go. But I can't speak to that. I'm saying in a world where Godwin's ready to come back from the ankle injury and he's going to be 100%, he'd be a really good fit because, there are a lot of other free agents who are available, but these are guys who, are the big names who are on the downside of their careers, like Amari Cooper, Brandon Cooks is another. I mean, I don't know if you really want to go the Stephon Diggs route. I think that's a difficult place to go. Godwin is still playing at a high level. Now, Godwin, again, was on his way to another 1,000-yard season this year. He had 50 catches for 576 yards in 7 games. So he was on pace to have a very big season for Tampa Bay. And again, he's still on the right side of 30. So there still could be some good football left in him. I understand players that age, you're always a little bit worried, but there aren't a lot of great options out there. And he's at least a guy who's, still kind of a guy who's still producing at a high level, and a guy who still hasn't hit that magic 3.0 and won't hit it for another year. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to a critical position, which in many ways is a strength for the Jets. That's the cornerback position. But there is a key player the Jets are going to have to replace. That's DJ Reed. And there's a potential free agent out there who might resemble Reed in certain ways. And I'll tell you who that is as we continue here on this Friday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because with FanDuel, you can place live bets through the game. So even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in on the action. If you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. You will love using FanDuel's live betting feature because it keeps every moment of the game exciting. Whether you're backing your team for a late-game rally or picking a player to hit a clutch three, you'll never feel like you missed your chance. Plus, the app is easy to use, and when you get paid, When you win, you get paid instantly. Right now, FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the National Basketball Association. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. A big shout out to you every dayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. On today's show, we're focused on free agency, which is coming up soon in the NFL. Which players should the Jets be interested in this offseason? And I think, as I mentioned in the first segment, the Jets may not be all in anymore, but that doesn't mean that they're going to just give up on 2025. They should be looking to add players who can help the team this year, but they should also be looking to add players who can help the team in future years. So I think that you're looking for guys who are on their second contract, guys in their mid 20s, because that's typically where you find gold in free agency. And there's going to be a hole that's created by the Jets if we assume that DJ Reed is not coming back to the team. DJ Reed's been an outstanding player for the Jets the last 3 years since they signed him as a free agent from the Seattle Seahawks in 2022. But by most accounts, it sounds like DJ Reed's not super interested in returning to the team after 3 seasons where he played quite well, but the team did not have success. So the Jets will have a hole at the number 2 corner position. Now, you might look at this and say, well, corner's still looking pretty good. You have Sauce Gardner, who's one of the, bit of a down season in 2024, but still one of the top corners in the NFL. You'd expect him to bounce back to form. In the slot, you have Michael Carter II, who, like Sauce, had kind of a down 2024. I think Carter dealt with a lot of injuries, was banged up, but prior to that had been an excellent slot corner. So two of your 3 starting corner slots, you're in pretty good shape, and that's probably accurate. But corner's a spot where you can never have enough quality players, because if you have one weak link, the other team's going to go after that guy. And with Sauce Gardner, maybe you can you can provide double teams for the second corner. But, in an ideal world, you'd like to have 3 guys who can cover. That's what the Jets have had the last couple of years with Gardner, Reed, and Carter. Now we're down to 2. And the other aspect of this is Aaron Glenn and Steve Wilkes are bringing in a defense, which I think we can surmise will blitz a lot. And blitzing a lot means that you're going to play a lot of man-to-man coverage. So corner is a spot where it's not a dire need for the Jets, but you'd like to find a quality replacement for DJ Reed. And the guy who I have in mind is actually a name that's going to sound familiar to a lot of people, but it's a different player. It is Asante Samuel Jr. Now, you probably are familiar with the name Asante Samuel, especially if you're a longtime NFL fan. Asante Samuel, who's his father, was a longtime corner in the league with the Eagles and the Patriots. So Jets fans may remember Asante Samuel from his time with the Patriots. He was a great guy playing off-man coverage, a real ball hawk, a guy who produced a lot of interceptions, some of which came against the Jets. Asante Samuel Jr. is set to be a free agent, and he's only 25. And he only turns 26 in October, so he'll start the season 25 years of age, a guy who's, kind of on the younger side for free agents. And you want to look for guys who are ascending, and you want to look for guys who still have a lot of good football left in front of them. And I feel like Asante Samuel Jr., it might be a really good guy to target for a couple of reasons. First of all, the age, again, only 25, and that's important at a position like corner, where, you're depending a lot on your athleticism, and it can go rather quickly, because some guys age rapidly. Well, Asante Samuel Jr. is 25, but the other aspects I like about him, first of all, he's shown an ability to play at a high level. He was a second-round pick a few years back by the Chargers in 2021, 47th overall, and played at a high level. But his stock may not be at its peak, because he's coming off a 2024 season that did not go all that well for him. He was banged up. He suffered a shoulder injury. He was placed on IR in October, so did not play much. Was also in a new system where with the Chargers, where he struggled a bit. But in the past, he's shown, first of all, an ability to play man-to-man coverage. Second is, he's kind of flashed some of his father's ability, reading plays in front of him. He can play zone, he can play off coverage. In many ways, I feel like he'd be a good upside play. Now, look, there is kind of there aren't a lot of great corners in the NFL, so maybe this is just wishful thinking to hope that the Jets could get him on a discount. 3 years ago when the Jets signed DJ Reed, it was a different scenario. Reed had less than a full season of starting experience. He looked like an ascending player because he had a really good season with Seattle, but he wasn't a guy with a long track record. Samuel is a former second round pick who, has played at a high level in the past, but he didn't play his best football last year. And maybe that means, you can get him at a relatively more reasonable price. He's still going to cost a lot of money because, there aren't a lot of great corners in the league. And because, he's a guy who has a famous father and a guy who was a high draft pick and a guy with a track record of playing well, but maybe it won't be quite as expensive as he would be in a normal scenario because he's coming off an injury that really shouldn't impact him all that much. But teams tend to overreact to the latest results a player put on the field. This is the type of player the Jets should be targeting. So, I think Asante Samuel Jr. would be a really intriguing option. But like I said, on this episode, I'm going to give you a backup option for all the players I list. And I think the backup option here is Carlton Davis, who played most of his career with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And actually, the last time he was a free agent, we talked a lot about him on this show as a potential target for the Jets. But he ended up re-signing with Tampa Bay. But during the 2024 season, he was traded to Detroit. So there are ties to Aaron Glenn. He did play with Aaron Glenn, and he in a season where the Detroit Lions had all sorts of injury issues at the corner spot. He was a guy who played pretty well during his time with Detroit, stepped in and gave the Lions some quality play. But he's a guy who he's also on the right side of 30. He's 28, and he doesn't turn 29 until the end of the season. So that's one of the benchmarks I always look for is 30 years old. I prefer to not get guys who are 30. Davis is going to be 28 for most of the season. He'll probably turn 29 week 16, week 17. So he'll have plenty of good. I mean, I don't know. He's got plenty of good ball in front of him, but I don't think he's going to be washed up this year. And the other aspect of this is a guy who's very well known for being a good one-on-one corner, a good man-to-man corner. Even if he ages a bit, he's not going to have to be the number one corner. In a lot of spots he's been in, especially with Tampa Bay, he's been the number one corner in the past. Whereas with the Jets, he can draw easier assignments. Sauce Gardner will be the guy who draws the tough assignment every week. So your number two corner is going to have an easier job. So, I know I mentioned that, for some guys it goes quickly, but for other guys have a more gentle slope in decline. And even if Davis, is starting to decline a little bit, he won't he won't be the guy taking the other team's best receiver on a weekly basis. So those are two guys who I think the Jets may look to free agency to deal with the corner position. I think that Samuel and Davis are both guys who would be logical fits for this team. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we have one last spot to talk about. It's on the offensive line, and I think the Jets are actually set it for the 5 positions. There's one spot, though, where there's a question mark. That's the right tackle position. Morgan Moses may not be coming back. There are some other directions the Jets may want to look, and I'll tell you what those directions are as we continue here on this Friday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. This is the Locked On Jets podcast on this Friday. We're putting our eye on free agency on today's show, talking about some players who could fill big needs for the Jets. Now, for the Jets heading into this offseason, they're in a rare spot because I think you can actually pencil in 4 of the 5 starters on the offensive line. You've got Olu Fashanu, who's going to play left tackle. You have John Simpson, who's going to play left guard. You have Joe Tippmann, who will play center, and Elijah Vera Tucker, who will play right guard. And normally this time of year, we're talking about how the Jets need to replace 3 starters. And we're trying to talk ourselves into the guy that struggled last year, bouncing back and having a big year. We're talking about, is Laken Tomlinson's going to be able to have recover this year? We're talking about, is Mekhi Becton going to finally make good on his problem? We're not doing that. We have 4 guys who at least are solid. And look, I don't know if this is going to be a top 5 offensive line, but we're entering an offseason where I don't think you're looking at the offensive line as one of the biggest weaknesses. The Jets do, however, have a question mark at the right tackle position because Morgan Moses is going to be a free agent, and Morgan Moses is in his mid-30s now. We're talking a 34-year-old guy, and there have been some rumors out there that the Jets are not inclined to bring Morgan Moses back, which I think understandably has led to some questioning from the fan base because Morgan Moses is nothing but a consummate professional and a guy who's been very solid during his Jets career and through the rest of his NFL career with Washington, with Baltimore. But while Morgan Moses was still a good player in 2024, his play was not as good as it's been in the past. So he's on a downward trajectory. And that downward trajectory still left him in a spot was good in 2024. But if that trajectory continues, it may not be good in 2025. And the other aspect of this is after being pretty much an Iron Man through most of his career, the last 2 years, Morgan Moses has dealt with injuries. Now, he's been able to get on the field for the most part. He hasn't missed many games, but we're talking trajectory here. Trajectory is going down in that area as well. And the other side of trajectory is thinking about John Simpson last year, which was, I think, by all accounts, an excellent signing by Joe Douglas. And did John Simpson have a fantastic resume? No, he did not. But there was a clear upward trajectory where, he went from being a guy in short order, a guy who was an offseason signing, a guy who was a reserve future signing, which meant he was not on an NFL roster at the end of the season. And within a couple of years, went from being a reserve future guy to being a guy who was starting at left guard for the Baltimore Ravens. And even though he wasn't a great left guard for the Ravens, you saw improvement, and he continued to improve with the Jets. So I think when you're talking about, in a lot of areas, not just the offensive line, but I think about Simpson, because that's exactly the kind of guy you want to sign. You want to sign somebody who's on a clear upward trajectory. A guy I look at, I'm not sure whether he'll be available because I think the Rams would be foolish to let him go, but Alaric Jackson. This is a guy who fits that mold of being on a clear upward trajectory. He was an undrafted free agent signing out of Iowa in 2021, played sparingly, then was kind of a part-time guy for the Rams in 2022. 2023, he takes over at a full-time role, and 2024, he really excels at both a pass blocker and a run blocker. Now, if the Rams are smart, they'll keep him. They'll keep him. They won't let him hit free agency. But if he does hit free agency, this is the type of guy the Jets should be all over, because this is a guy who played really good football last year, and he's a guy who's, again, he's in his mid-20s. He's not super old. He's only 4 years in the league. He's 26. He'll turn 27 in July. So hopefully his best football is in front of him. And another aspect of this is he's a good run blocker. He's been a good run blocker in his career, and we've talked about this on the show about how Jets offensive line is pretty good pass blocking, but they don't necessarily have a ton of strong run blockers. If you put a right tackle next to Elijah Vera-Tucker, though, then you got a right side of the offensive line that, at least on paper, should be able to run block effectively. Now, the one caveat here, which I think people will rightly point out, is Jackson was left tackle for the Rams this year. And so that means either Jackson or Fashanu is going to have to move to right tackle. And I would understand why Jets fans would be a little bit nervous about that, because Fashanu, of course, was drafted to be the long-term left tackle, but started the year as kind of like the swing guy. He could play either left or the right side, and then they even kicked him inside the guard. And Fashanu really didn't start playing well until they stuck him at left tackle, which was his natural position. So with that in mind, I would be inclined to maybe leave Olu at left tackle. But I think it's also important to know that there are players who have moved from one side to the other in their careers and still been successful. So it's not like it's impossible to move a guy from the right side to the left side and have that guy be successful. And, as far as Jackson goes, he's played left tackle the last couple of years for the Rams, but, if you pay him, I think if you pay him a decent amount, I don't know that he's necessarily going to care. I think that, guys on the rookie contract care a lot more whether they play right tackle or left tackle, because left tackles get paid more. You're paying a guy good money. After you pay him, I don't think he's going to care all that much. So if the Jets went in this direction, and one of the aspects of this is that you look through the free agent tackles, there's not really anybody that's that great at right tackle. So I think you are probably looking at moving a left tackle somewhere. And my backup plan would be the left tackle from the Pittsburgh Steelers, Dan Moore, who not a great player. And the Steelers offensive line had issues, but Moore had a good season. Again, it was his best season. Guy who's 26, going to turn 27 late September. So most of the season he'll be 27. So again, he fits that trajectory upward, mid-20s, maybe scratching the late 20s. The reason that I would put him behind Alaric Jackson is that Moore does not have a great track record as a run blocker. Now, a guy he's a solid pass blocker, not spectacular, but solid, but not a great run blocker. So if you got him, you'd have 5 guys who can pass block. The pass blocking would be very solid, and that's really the last spot you need is a right tackle. And you have the complications because somebody'd have to move from left tackle to right tackle. I think it would be more in this case, but I think that you're really looking for a guy who can handle the position. Above all else, on the offensive line, you just want a guy who's not going to be a disaster, because a guy who's a disaster on the offensive line can sink your offense. In an ideal world, the Jets would be able to get somebody who's both an effective and a capable pass blocker and an effective and capable run blocker. But if you can get somebody in here who's at least a functional pass blocker, even if they're not spectacular, if that's like the fifth best guy on your offensive line, you're in pretty decent shape, and you're putting whoever the quarterback is in a position to have success. And we know that the quarterback position is a bit up in the air for the New York Jets right now. They may have to go with somebody who's kind of an upside play, kind of a reclamation project. So in that case, you want to put as good of an offensive line in front of them, especially pass blocking, as possible. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoyed the show and are listening on the podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out. It helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Hope you have a wonderful weekend. So I'm going to be honest with you. I'm actually, for the first time in my life, I'm going skydiving this weekend. So depending on how things go, I mean, this could be the series finale of Locked On Jets, but assuming everything goes okay, we'll talk again on Monday. We'll talk more about the Jets. I look forward to doing that. See you later. Have a great weekend.